We have something that I call an evidence-based narration of history, which I come about with, and something called an enforced narrative of history. Who is enforcing this? It is there in your NCERT textbooks. It is there in the Constitution. It is there in every government law that has been put on us. It is there in the media. It is there in the movies that you watch, the novels that you read. Everybody enforces this narrative of history on us, but there is a real history that has not been talked about. We are an ancient civilization, but they tell us that we are a recent civilization. After the invading Aryans made contact with the Greeks in Magadha in 300 BC, suddenly we got the Brahmi script, Ashokan script. We became civilized overnight. So we are a young civilization according to NCERT textbooks. We are an indigenous people, but then they say that there's an Aryan invasion and migration. So we are supposed to be Aryans, Dravidians, and tribal people. That's who we Indians are, according to this narrative. We have got knowledge systems that are developed independently in India, but then they say our knowledge system was developed with input from Babylon, Greece, and so on. We have got humane, enlightened philosophies in our Vedanta and so on, but then they say that we are aggressive, uncivilized, inhumane philosophies. That's how we are positioned. We can show that Indian knowledge systems impacted many civilizations, but they say that other civilizations impacted Indian knowledge systems. So this is what we are learning. Our children are learning this. But then the reality is far from this. What is the contribution of Indians to science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and so on? So we had first the people who wrote the history of India. I called it the frameworks. The colonial people, when they came to India, they wanted to write a history of India. They wanted to show Indians as primitive, backward, stagnant, superstitious society, whereas the Europeans are forward, progressive, technologically advanced, enlightened society. So that's the way they wrote our history, followed by Eurocentric people who wanted to say, why is Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek related? So they said it's related because there's an ancestral language, Proto-Indo-European. I'll talk about that a little later. Wherever these people went, the missionaries were not far behind. So the missionaries wanted to convert Indians to Christianity. So all the translations of Sanskrit literature, the Puranas, for example, Itihasas, that was translated into English, German, and other languages by missionaries with a certain idea to show you as primitive, backward, and all those kind of things. Then, since 1947, we have inherited, unfortunately, Nehruvian socialism in the country, which brought about its own biases into the discourse, and we have had our history written in a certain way, constitution written in a certain way, and so on. And since 1972, we have also had the Marxist perspective in India, where they brought in their own perspectives too. So what we have is, we have history of India that has been hijacked by all these forces who have imposed their ideologies on it, and has led to a subversion of our identity. Here, I can take anybody in this room and ask, who are you as a Bharatiya person? Nobody will be able to answer that correctly. Nobody here can connect to the ancient civilization saying, I'm a proud inheritor of the civilization, because all our minds have been colonized. The British might have left, but our minds are still colonized, and we still go through nonsense and rubbish like this. So over 300 years, colonial hegemony, Portuguese, Dutch, French, British, so they came about with Christian imperialism. People like Caldwell and Pope, they brought about the idea that Hinduism is a post-flood religion. Something called caste was imposed on us. Indians only had jati, varna, kulam, gotra. This is what we've had for thousands and thousands of years. But they came and told us, you have something called caste. So their experience of caste was imposed on us, and they said, you're a caste-ridden society, whatever that means. So this is what we were positioned as. They said that the people called Dravidians are oppressed people. In India, the Sanskrit word Dravida means southern region of India. But then this man, Caldwell, who's a missionary, he made the English word called Dravidian. Dravidian was supposed to be a racial category, whereas there's no such thing in India. Always Dravida has meant southern region of India. On the other hand, the colonial scholars Max Muller, Herbert Risley brought in Eurocentric kind of ideas with linguistics, anthropology, caste. They identified somebody called Sandrakottos. Sandrakottos is mentioned in the Greek called Megasthenes, who came to India around 300 BC. He said he met an emperor called Sandrakottos. So William Jones, who's one of the persons over here, he looked at the Purana king list. In the Purana king list, he wanted to say who are the Sandrakottos, how can we attach Western history and have an anchor point with Indian history, right? So he said there is a name called Chandragupta Maurya. He is perhaps the Sandrakotos. By doing that, he said, now we have a reference point between Western and Indian history. Unfortunately, it's utterly bogus. According to the Purana chronology, the Mauryas are supposed to be 1200 BCE. But after this distortion was done, it was brought down to 300 BCE. Before they did any of these things, we had perfect synchronism between the Purana king list, Kashmir king list, Nepal king list, everything had perfect synchrony. But after they did what they did, even today we cannot reconcile our traditional chronology along with what they say is the history of India. So this is the nonsense that we are studying, unfortunately. And they came about the idea that somebody called Aryans came to India, invaded India in 1500 BCE. In India, we always had the word Arya as an honorific. If you're a noble person, dharmic person, you're an Arya. For example, Dushasana was supposed to be an Anarya because of his role in disrobing Draupadi. He behaved very not nobly, right? So he's called Anarya. But then these people, they made a race called Aryans, the English word Aryans. So this is the nonsense that we have. Dravida, Arya, these are known in this country for different reasons, but converted into racial reasons by these people. Anyway, this is what we have, unfortunately. And if you think that these are all relics of the past, we don't have to care about it today, it's unfortunately very true. This is the received wisdom of for all our academia today. Our academia takes whatever the colonialists have said without questioning, and it continues on to the present day. And we have, unfortunately, all this nonsense happening. Hand in hand with archaeology. So archaeology attempts to find some proof for the so-called Aryan Dravidian ideology and so on. Hand in hand with genetics, people like David Reich and others. And there are some convergent ideologies, and still it impacts the basic identity of the Bharatiya person. That is what we see over here. Today in the South, we also have something called Dravidianism, a deracinated framework that occupies a lot of these kind of thoughts. We also have in the West, Islamism and wokeism that has come about, which is also imported into India, and we see these kind of things happening. And they claim victimhood. They want to show that we are victims of a dominant ideology, and therefore they need some special considerations. Why does any of this thing matter? In a talk on knowledge systems, why does this matter? It matters because they say Aryans invaded India in 1500 BC. These were nomads from Central Asia, not just nomads, illiterate. They didn't have a script. They only had an oral tradition. They didn't have a script. So they were running around in northern India with caste, cow, and all these kind of things. And India had to wait for 1,000 years for civilization to return to Magadha after the Greeks invaded India around that time. And they said that after they got there, we got the Brahmi script, we became civilized. Then they turn around and say, yours is a young civilization. You have not had enough time for knowledge generation in mathematics, in astronomy, in medicine. Therefore, if you have Surya Siddhanta, deep astronomy, you must have learnt it from the Babylonians. If you got Shushruta Samhita, a lot of medicine, you must have got it from somebody else. Mathematics, you got it from somebody else. So this is why it matters a lot. So in today's NCERT kind of narrative, it tells us that Aryans brought Sanskrit into India from Central Asia. The script Brahmi came from Aramaic in the Levant. The Greeks taught us math and sciences. Astronomy came from Babylon. The Turkic Muslims taught us culture, cuisine, architecture, music, and civilization. The British taught us science, technology, and rational thought. They even say Bhakti came to us from St. Thomas. So this is the kind of thinking that is there in the present discourse, unless we have some way of countering this. I, as a scientist, say, all right, you have one set of claims here, you have another set of claims here. How do you evaluate that? So we are rational, scientific people who are evidence-based. So everything that I say as a scientist is evidence-based, and I try to see how can we find evidence for this? There is a lot of data for history, whether the data comes from archaeology, climate records, astronomy, religion, wherever. This data can be used in a linguistic model, archaeology model, genetics model, astronomy model. So many models are possible. What is a model? A model is our attempt to say some phenomena. If the fan is rotating there, I say there's a magic guy sitting there. If I turn on the switch, something beats the magic guy and it turns the fan. That is a model, right? It's utter nonsense, but it's still a model that explains how that fan is working. If you have better idea, you'll say it's electricity. If I turn that on, the switch, the current flows and the fan rotates, right? But they are models nevertheless. So you have a bunch of models that have been proposed. You take the data, analyze it with the models, analyze the models, methods, frameworks, and see are these sound or are there logical inconsistencies, are there problems with it. That is how we try to understand this. And in my work, I try to see the data, is it high quality data? Is it medium quality data? Not all data is the same, is it? Some are low quality data. We try to see that. Then we see, is there evidence of contact? If we say Indian knowledge historically went out of India to other civilizations, then I must show three things. I must first show, is there evidence that we had contact? India had a contact, some other civilization, that is one. Second thing, is there evidence that somebody took knowledge from India and took it to the other civilization? Two. Third is even more deeper, is there evidence of use of Indian knowledge system in a foreign civilization? If we can show all these three things, we have very strong results. Sometimes we can't, we can only show 1 and 2. Sometimes we can show 1, 2, and 3. This is an ongoing research, right? So I'm going to show you some of these things. So when I do a rebuttal to the way history is presented in India, I first need to show that India is an ancient civilization, right? So to do that, there are several things I can do. One is I show that textual evidence has got no memory of invasion, migration in any time frame. If I take 100 scholars of India, whether it's Abhinavagupta, whether it's Agastya, whether it's Andal, whether it's Yajnavalkya, Vyasa, anybody, any geography, North India, South India, East India, West India, 3000 BC, 100 current era, nobody anywhere is talking about an invasion. Nobody anywhere is saying we used to live beyond the mountains, we crossed the mountains and came to this country. Nobody is saying we took swords and beat these guys in the north and forced them to the south. Nobody in the south is saying we used to live in the north and then we were pushed to the south. Nobody is saying we are North Indians, we are South Indians. Nobody is saying any of these things. But unfortunately, 200 years ago, the British came and said you're Aryans and Dravidians and you have an Aryan invasion, and we believe this nonsense totally. We ignore the evidence that we have in our own civilization. Any book, any author you take, you will not find memory of any kind of invasion. This is common sense staring at us. Archaeology. Typically, people say if a new civilization comes into a country, even the technology of that civilization will be in the archaeological record. What is the technology? The pots and pans, right? If there's a different kind of pot and pan in the archaeological record, then I can say maybe those are the Aryans. But the reality in India is there is absolutely no change in the ceramic record. They say something called ochre colored pottery, OCP, is associated with the Aryan invasion. But there are papers that show ochre colored pottery is as old as 4000 BCE, 3000 BCE. Aryan invasion is supposed to be 1500 BC, which means even that is not a reliable indicator of any invasion. Genetics, I do a lot of work in genetics too, and say that there's absolutely no marker that can conclusively say that we are come from Central Asia or elsewhere into India. Any Indians you take and analyze the mutations that we have, you cannot cluster them and say this is a North Indian gene, this is a South Indian gene. No such thing is possible anywhere in India. Many studies have been done, whether in Uttarakhand, whether it is in Karnataka, whether it is in Andhra, various places. They take these things called FST, fixation index, trying to see mathematically what is the distance between the markers that I have and the markers that you have or somebody else. We cannot say, yes, in my case the number is 0.1, in his case the number is 0.9, so I can put it into two buckets. That is not possible. All the numbers for all Indians are all the same range, saying that we are all so mixed. There is no Brahmin gene, there is no Kshatriya gene, there is no Vyasa gene or Shudra gene. No such thing, no untouchable gene, whatever. We don't have that. We are all the same, we are Indians. That's why the notion of Aryans, Dravidians, tribals is a spurious identifier. Climatology. In climatology, we can show that there was a 200-year monsoon failure in 2000 BCE, during which time a lot of Indians migrated out of India. We can show that. Geology shows there was a powerful Saraswati river that used to flow in northern India from the mountains all the way to the ocean. But hydrology tells us that there was tectonic movements in northern India around 1900 BCE, and the Sutlej used to feed into the Saraswati river, but it changed course and is feeding the present-day Indus River. When that happened, Saraswati River got it did not get enough water and it dried up. But the issue is, it dried up by 1900 BCE. But they tell us the Aryans came to India in 1500 BCE and they composed Rig Veda in India. How can the Aryans in Rig Veda say, here is a mighty, powerful flowing Saraswati river? It was not flowing when they are supposed to have come. It's a very, very big problem with that. Then we have astronomy. Many things that I talk about in astronomy in our texts show very great antiquity, going to 8,000 years before present, 10,000 years before present. How is it possible that Aryans come to India in 1200 BC, compose all our Brahmanas, Upanishads, and all these works, but then they have got astronomy over there, which mathematically can show belongs to 8,000 BC, belongs to 6,000 BC. There's some problem over there. So taking all of this together, we can have a rebuttal with evidence-based rational examination. We can say whatever NCERT is teaching is a criminal distortion. A lot of people should be behind bars for the kind of thing we're teaching our children because of the evidence that we have today.